I'm grateful to you all this evening for coming out. I have to say that for those who are watching from home, if I were you, I would just crack open a bottle right now because this stuff you can't make up. The story that I'm going to tell you this evening is one that is remarkable beyond words. But I hope that as we go through it this evening, one of the things that you'll see is that in our area, we have such a unique setting in terms of our resources, in terms of topography, so that it's possible for us to grow a crop like wine grapes. And so it's very much tied to natural history, and you're going to hear a good bit of that this evening as we go forward. So just getting started, we are going to introduce you to the Virginia wine industry today, which of course is just developing in leaps and bounds. And as you can see, the contribution to the Virginia economy is pretty significant. And these are just the most recent numbers, and I think that you're probably looking at, I would think, an underestimation. I think this is probably a conservative amount. And so when we think about wine in Virginia today, we have wonderful vineyards. We are living in an area not far from 151, where you have that beautiful venue through the Rockfish Valley and all of the vineyards, but also thinking about the breweries and the cideries and things that are developing in this area. People have always had an interest in alcohol here. Long interest in alcohol. And so we preface this talk, I preface this talk, and when I say we, it's because I've worked on this project for so long with my students that it is our project. It's not my project, it's our project. And so forgive me when you hear me say that, but that's not to confuse you. But I do want to begin by telling you the story that is often told about Virginia wine, and that is that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson tried their best. You may know that at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson cleared almost several hundred acres of land in order to grow wine grapes that he had brought from, the starts that he had gotten from Europe, and failed. And the same thing happened at Mount Vernon. It happened in many other places. And so the story was essentially that the native grapes that grew in Virginia, and this is a pretty classic example, this is from 2019, the pungent, foxy, native Labrusca varietals, and that's the wild grape, essentially, generally made poor or cloying wine. And that's the story that has always been told. But I am here tonight to tell you that this is false. That indeed commercial wine production in Virginia got off the ground long before the 1970s. It's just that we forgot. And so tonight the story is about that early wine industry in Virginia and the questions that it poses for us today. And looking at it through historical research and archaeological field research. That's how we tell this story. And so the story is about Belmont, and this is a photograph from about 1900. It was a commercial wine concern, and basically it was built on the native grapes of the native grape of the eastern United States and varieties that were hybridized from it. And so I want you to think about this as many of you have visited wineries. This is a 3-story operation with 2 3-story wine cellars. This is serious business. And so how did that happen? And how did we forget about it? That's the really interesting question. How did we forget about it? So let me just tell you a little bit about where it is located in Shenandoah National Park. And as consulting archaeologist, I was called in. There was a ranger who was getting ready to retire, and he said, you know, there's this place in the North District where there are just wine grapes everywhere, and there was supposed to have been this winery. Go up and take a look at it. I'll go with you before I retire, and I'll show it to you. And it was Belmont. And so so as you come in through Front Royal, through the north entrance to the park, the first mountain there is Dickey Ridge. And so essentially it is very, very close to the Dickey Ridge Visitor Center. And when you think about its location today, Glen Manor Vineyards is just down the hill from it. And Glen Manor Vineyards, of course, has won many awards, many medals in the Governor's Cup. So it is a place where people have successfully grown wine grapes and made wine for a long time. When you come into the North District, if you know where to look, you will recognize that there is just the slightest little dip in the vegetation where the trees are a little bit shorter than they are around it, and that's where Belmont is located. So the story of Belmont begins with the Buck family, and that's the name you will hear tonight throughout this discussion. They were very well positioned in Virginia society. They were wealthy people. They were what you would consider to be the elite in the Shenandoah Valley at this time. But between 1753, 1796, they purchased over 2,000 acres of land from the Lord Fairfax proprietary. And so if you are familiar with this part of Virginia, Strasburg is to the west here and Front Royal to the right, and that's Route 55 that goes around Signal Knob, which is the north end of Massanutten Mountain. It is beautiful. It leads up into Fort Valley, for those of you who know that area as well. And so this was the place where they sat down. But they also their children began to do very well for themselves. And you can see this is a drawing that was made by one of the family members in the late 19th century, a memory of all the Buck properties around Front Royal. And so what you're seeing is, this is Belmont. I don't have a pointer here, I'm sorry, but you can barely see Belmont over on the far left, and then all of the other Bucks who had made themselves at home in Front Royal. So these were folks who were going places, as we might say. The person we're going to talk about this evening is this fellow, Marcus Blakemore Buck, and you can see his dates there, but he purchased, with family money, almost 2,000 acres of land himself in the Blue Ridge, in that area today that is the North District of Shenandoah National Park, but he sold a bunch of it very quickly because he knew he wanted to do something up there and needed money. He sold the 450 acres to the Fox family, and for those who know the park, there is the Fox Trail off of Dickey Ridge when you go up to the park and go to that visitor center. So that family very much is present in this part of the park. Marcus and his wife Jane named this property Belmont, and they constructed a beautiful house in 1848. So that sets the stage. Now, there's no question that one of the reasons Belmont was successful is because the family invested in a railroad. So the Manassas Gap Railroad, that was the major transportation technology, I guess you could say, for this part of the valley, was established. And essentially, they set up a station at Buckton, which is the name that their area came to be known as. And so you can see Buckton Station, and then Front Royal over here on the right, Strasburg is over to the left. So again, if you ever have a chance to drive up in that area or heading up to Fort Valley, it's a beautiful, beautiful place. But these are Civil War era maps, and the Civil War looms large in this story. The Buck family had several sons who fought for the Confederacy. Marcus had a son who was killed in one of the battles at Manassas. But more to the point, as the family established the farm on this acreage that they had, they began to feed the town of Front Royal. They began to feed families in Front Royal who did not have food, but also people who would come through the mountain looking for food, looking for a place to stay, would end up at Belmont. Now, it is the case that when you start looking at some of these Civil War era maps, Marcus Buck shows up, and it's because he was known to be someone who took in both Union and Confederate soldiers as they were coming through. So he is on these maps. But the other thing to keep in mind is that from a strategic point of view, Signal Knob, which is the north end of Massanutten Mountain, had lookout towers and that were used by both the Union and the Confederacy. And it is said that there was also a lookout tower at Belmont. We've not found it archaeologically, but in the records, there is mention of a lookout tower at Belmont. So just its position made it one of these places that was of great interest to the military folks who were coming through that area. But when the Bucks owned Belmont, they were farming. They started out farming. They started out with, as you can see, mixed grain, livestock. They raised cattle, well known for their cattle, and they had fruit. And this is an 1890 photograph of their house. And if any of you have been in the park today, you'll see from the photographs I'm going to show in a little bit, it doesn't look like this anymore. But it gives you a sense of the way in which they were bringing this elite vision of life in the Shenandoah Valley up into the Blue Ridge at this time. One thing about Marcus, though, that makes this a particularly interesting story is that he kept a daily diary. He was of the bent of scientific farming, and in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s in Virginia, there was a strong movement toward scientizing agriculture, that is to say, using fertilizer, keeping records, paying attention to the varieties of crops that you were planting, and so forth. And so he was part of that. He bought into that, and essentially every day wrote in his diary, every single day. And it has been transcribed, but the originals are in special collections at the University of Virginia and at the libraries. And we've been there a number of times going through these diaries because it's remarkable what's in them. And so, for example, in this particular instance, he's talking about the work that they're doing around the farm. He says that we stopped at Mrs. Colson's house and saw his wine press, vineyard, and winemaking. We're trying to figure out who that is, right? And then we were digging potatoes and that sort of thing. But then look at what happens. Monday, October 17th, Letitia, cousin Helen, went to Winchester digging potatoes in the vineyard. So they had started the vineyard and they were intercropping. They were doing what we call intercropping, hauling out chaff, hauling sand, court day in Front Royal, terrible riot and insurrection in Harper's Ferry. So this is John Brown's raid. And so it's full of this. It is absolutely full of this. His diary could be used to literally plot the movements of troops and military personnel all through this area during the time of the Civil War. But in going through these diaries, and you can see there were over 5,000 entries, the question was, how do you use this? How do you use this for historic scholarship? And so we coded the diaries. What we did is we went through every single entry. We made notes on particular things. We made notes on weather. We made notes on whether he wrote about damage, what was going on the farm, where he was working on the farm, because different fields had different names, who was working with him, and then if there was a major event. And in this particular instance, we're looking at March and April of 1865, and as you read in the right-hand column going down, terrible battle at Richmond, rumors Richmond fell with Lee, report General Lee surrendered, starving soldiers returning, Richard O.K., that's his son, Lincoln assassinated. And so again, every day, things like this that we read about in history books, they are in his diary as basically he's giving that kind of firsthand account, so to speak. But we wanted to also really focus in on the vineyard because as we were working in the field and fighting our way through grapevines, which you're going to see in a little bit, the question became, how exactly did he do this? And what did this vineyard look like? So we were going through and we found, for example, the numbers of production. We found that he was making on a regular basis, and this is right after the war is over, and so production is not what it would become later on, but still 2,300 gallons of pure juice, and then people taking grapes away to consume. But you can see his list, this is what we did in the vineyard, and so on and so forth. So this is a gold mine of information. There's very little documentation like this that we know of in Virginia, and we just happened upon it in our process. So we have Belmont Vineyards. Started in 1859 as a formal business, went until about 1900, and when it started in 1859, there were 10 acres, and by the time it was finished, there were 100 acres in production. So in 1884, that's a big vineyard. That's a very big vineyard. And the diary talks about 15 different varieties of grapes that they were growing, and that's in itself a story. That's pretty cool. But just to give you a comparison so that you know what that means, we're talking about 100 acres in production Today, most of the vineyards in Virginia are less than 10 acres in size, okay? And the average is about 15 acres. So there are a few behemoths out there, there are a few big ones, but by and large, winemaking in Virginia is still a pretty small enterprise. And so for someone to be growing 100 acres of grapes in the Blue Ridge on the side of a mountain in the 1850s, 60s, and so forth, that's a pretty wild idea. Like I said, you can't make this stuff up. So here we go. These are the varieties that he was growing. This is the wild fox grape. That's what this is called, and some of you who hike around probably have seen these before. You've seen the little tiny grapes that will ripen up in the late summer, early fall, and if you've ever tasted them, they're pretty sweet, you know, but they have big seeds in them, so they're not ideal. But they basically formed the foundation of the wine industry in the eastern United States. Okay, so it's a beautiful example of using a native species. But we also know that he was growing Concord grapes, and they were beautifully adapted to cooler climates. They largely were grown more in the upper Midwest and in New York State, and he brought them to the Blue Ridge. The Catawba, some of you are probably familiar with the pinker grape called the Catawba, and then there was a cross, and you can see that they were derived from the fox grape. There was a lot of experimentation going on. These folks who were involved in winemaking were creating the varieties that would become the basis for, in many instances, what we drink today. And so they were, in a sense, citizen scientists who were taking what they had and then doing all kinds of experiments themselves to see what they could come up with. But we also want to mention this one, the Diana grape. He talks about this particular grape that came from Massachusetts. We have the Delaware grape out of the Ohio Valley that came directly from the fox grape, Vitis labrusca. We have the Isabella grape, and this has a really interesting story. This is a grape that today is grown all over the world. It is grown in Asia primarily. At one time it was the basis of the Australian wine industry, but the Isabella grape is blamed for bringing a sap-sucking insect called phylloxera to Europe that essentially wiped out most of the French wine industry in the 19th century. The French wine industry was saved by grafting onto the French vines some American varieties that could withstand phylloxera. And so I find that to be a pretty amazing story in itself. And then you have something called the Ives grape. Again, these are varieties that we don't hear about today, but he was growing them in great number. The Crevlin and the Hartford grape. We get pretty excited about this stuff. The Rogers grape and the Clinton grape. Who is this guy in the Blue Ridge who is doing all of this experimentation and writing to people, in essence, in Europe, writing to people in the Midwest, writing to people all over the eastern seaboard to learn about grape cultivation and to get varieties and to bring them back to Virginia. And then, of course, the Norton grape. He was in correspondence with Dr. Norton in Richmond, and all of the other grapes that he was growing were primarily very sweet grapes, and the wine that was made at that time was more of a table wine, very sweet wine, whereas the Norton, as some of you know, is a drier red. And so that became very popular as well. So he was bringing that up to the Blue Ridge in the 1850s. But he was also in the nursery business. So the wine grapes that he was growing, he would make cuttings, and with the railroad, he was shipping them all over the eastern United States. And so that was a big part of his business. That's one of his slips that we found in special collections, where he was keeping track of just how many slips he had cut in different days. But why here and why now? Why is it that people were getting so interested in commercial wine production? Prior to this, people had been making wine. My goodness, you go back to the beginnings of the Virginia colony at Jamestown, and there is wine production going on there, but at very, very small scale, household scale wine. So why do we have this essentially burgeoning industry developing at this time period? It has to do with the fact that the federal government was concerned about how drunk the American public was on whiskey. And they were thinking, the American government and different agencies within the government were thinking that perhaps there's one way to control the drunkenness in the United States by getting people to leave the hard stuff behind and go to wine. And so what you see here is that when we think about this, the numbers are pretty remarkable because distilling technology had really developed, and essentially the annual per capita consumption between 1800 and 1830 was 5 gallons. That means per capita. That would include babies. Babies weren't drinking 5 gallons of whiskey, but adults were. So you get the idea, right? And so the government is saying, let's have an effort where we get people to start growing wine, where we develop this industry where folks can make money if they will grow wine. And so by the 1820s, Cincinnati, Ohio had become a center of wine production with the Catawba grape. And what you're looking at here is really an amazing table that we found, but look at what it shows us. What it shows us is that even though this is 1792 to 1882, look at the American wines category. You can see that nobody's keeping track until you get to between 1830 and 1840, and all of a sudden 800,000 gallons of wine are being produced. And then you can see the numbers increasing, but you will also notice that the other numbers are not going down. And so this ploy did not work. I call this the first attempt at temperance, but it didn't work. But it led to the development of the wine industry. So what are you going to do? But also people were getting very excited about buying wine grapes now and planting them in their yards. And so there were catalogs, just like we get seed catalogs every year. You could get catalogs for grape starts, grapevines, and small fruits. Big business at this time, and Marcus Buck was in the middle of it. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote an interminable poem about the wine industry in Cincinnati, where he was from. But it was very, very popular for people to think about grapevines, to think about wine, and to see it as something that was going to build the economy. The strangest part of this story, I think, well, one of the strange parts of this story is that you have to think about, how do you make wine? What do you need? Well, you can just you can press your grapes, you can crush your grapes and put them in a barrel and hope for the best, but you really need something that's going to act as a catalyst, and that's sugar. And so where were they getting sugar from? Well, they were growing sugar cane. Marcus Buck was growing sugar cane in the Virginia Blue Ridge, and he was using that to make his wine. And we did research on this, and we found that there were families to the south of here in the Blue Ridge, Meadows of Dan, 1980s into the 1990s, who were still growing sugar cane and making sugar. It's not something you think of for Virginia, but they did it. But I do want to point out to you the recipe. So this is the recipe for Catawba grape wine. And remember, I said it's sweet, right? So mash your grapes to a pulp, let them stand for 24 hours, squeeze through a cloth, and add 2 pounds of sugar to each gallon of juice. 2 pounds of sugar to each gallon of juice. Can't imagine what that would have tasted like, but that was it was sort of the American version, I guess, of a port wine, fortified wine, I would say. But also there were books being written about how you grow grapes. And one of the really cool things we have found is that Marcus, in his diaries, writes about trying new ways of trellising his vines, of planting the vines, and as they are growing, this layering technique. And we know that he was doing that in his vineyard. So that's pretty cool in itself. So this is what his year would look like. So in March, he was clearing the vineyard. Early to mid-April, that's when he would plant his new slips, plowing and manuring in late April. May, working in the vineyards, pruning the vines, suckering the vines, meaning planting the new ones that were coming out, putting them down in the ground so that they would take off. And then fighting with bugs in the vineyard. He writes about that a lot, working in the vineyards. Then in mid-September to mid-October, gathering and pressing his grapes, preparing grapes for sieve, harvesting and processing his cane sugar, that comes, and then filling the barrels. And then by December, he's ready to make his wild grape wine. So he's been working with his cultivars until December, and then he gets there, and then he fills his barrels. And this is not unusual for winemakers today. This is very much a calendar that is held to today in many instances. So this is exactly what he was doing. And his diary shows this repeating year after year after year. He was getting pretty good at it. Now, one thing that we do know is that Marcus was not able to do this by himself. Marcus was an enslaver, and we have been following the story of the people who were enslaved on the farm. We actually don't have names for them yet, but we are beginning to find the names of people who, after emancipation, came back to the farm to work as paid laborers. More on that in just a moment. But you can see that by 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was written and read, when it was issued, the enslaved left Belmont. And so Marcus was left with this incredibly large vineyard and no one to work in it. And in his diary, he writes about going into Front Royal and trying to get the people he'd been feeding to come up and work in the vineyard. And he was not having much success with that. But he petitioned the government in 1867 for reparations, essentially claiming that he had always been a Union man. Now, two of his sons had fought for the Confederacy. He had allowed both Union and Confederate troops through his property. But essentially, he was given that pardon. He was actually given that pardon, and he was given reparations for damages that were done. And you can see that in 1867, this is when he opened a distillery and built his first wine cellar, and he had 5,000 fruit trees. So it wasn't just wine. He was growing peaches and apples and pears, all of those things. He had really gone into the business big time. And so this is a photograph of what his establishment looked like, essentially. You're looking at the first floor, the lower floor, devoted to hogsheads, meaning the big barrels that held about little over 1,000 gallons each. And we know that he had them made in Germany, and they were shipped to Front Royal. And so, again, the funding that went into this enterprise, the money that went into this business, but this was the winery. That's what you're looking at right there. And so we've done research, and we have found some comparative cases from North Carolina. In this particular instance, the Weller Vineyard, which was known for Scuppernong, which is also a very sweet wine in North Carolina, but this is an example of what those barrels would have looked like. They were big enough for a person to stand up inside and clean. And you get a sense of just the magnitude of the production. This is where things start to head south. This is where Marcus made an error, and that is in 1870, he and his son, Jacqueline, which was a male name at that time, he and his son began to speculate in land. They began buying up land in Indiana. They began buying up land in other places, and the idea is they were going to sell that land and make money to support the vineyard because he wanted to grow the business even further. And so when I say that this was a mistake, what I mean is, while he's getting a lot of press in the newspaper from Richmond all up and down the East Coast, we have found references to Belmont in New York newspapers. It was well known. So while the praises of Belmont were being sung, essentially he was selling locally. He was selling locally to the drugstore. That was one of the ways he was getting his wine out. People thought everything was great, but there was a panic. In the fall of 1873, there was a serious depression. Land prices fell, and he lost everything. And the saddest part of the whole story is that, you remember all those families? Remember all the bucks who were in Front Royal? They had all invested in the business. And so this is his brother, who lived in this beautiful home, Bel Air, which is still there in Front Royal. But you can just read this. I was called and returned home to learn of the failure of my brother, M.B. Marcus. I was utterly ruined, being an endorser for over $100,000, $2 million today. And so essentially he had to give up his house. He had to give up his property, and other family members did as well. And so as we got into the records, we found that letters between the brothers had been saved, and it's devastating to read the decline of their relationship over this business problem, over what had happened with the land and the poor investments, and ultimately the family just kind of disappears from Front Royal. So there are hardly any bucks remaining in Front Royal after about 1900. So a family that was there and so well established and just sort of blazed this industry all of a sudden is gone. Well, what happens to the winery? Interestingly enough, they kept making wine. There were family members who took over the vineyard and they kept making wine, and they were winning medals at competitions. So the Governor's Cup goes to Glen Manor every now and then, just down the hill from Belmont, but these folks were medaling as well. And in 1876, Belmont was sold on the steps of the courthouse in Front Royal. And it's a sad thing, but at the same time, remarkable for us because it lists everything. It tells us everything that was there. And you can see 800 acres, the brick mansion, the outbuildings, 12 tenant houses, vineyards and orchards, and you can see the appliances for manufacturing. And so Marcus's cousin bought it for $15,000. And continued to run the winery, for 10 years after that, at least. And so he dies, Marcus dies in 1881, and his tombstone, no hand ever went empty if in his power to fill, because he was known for being a very generous person. And that's what you can see on his tombstone today if you go take a look at it. But also, he was not forgotten. And so the Manassas Gap Railroad became the Virginia Midland Railway, and it became a tourist, basically a tourist train. And there were folks who would be riding on the Virginia Midland Railway, and they would be told stories about the areas they were riding through. And this is the story that was told about Belmont when people would come to Front Royal. So he had made such a name for himself and for the winery that it was remembered long into the 1780s and 1790s. Again, Albany Evening Journal talking about the fact that maximum storage of these, the wine cellars is 60,000 barrels. Isn't that amazing? 60,000 barrels of wine. And they talk about the fact that there are 3-story wine cellars, the production house, wine presses, a 5,000-gallon cistern. This is a huge operation, as well as a dry house. We also know that he was shipping wine wine slips, as we were saying, as he was cutting the vines, and the family continued to do this. Marcus, of course, is gone. But you can see they were being sent all over the eastern United States. It's just an amazing part of this story. Jed Hotchkiss, the cartographer of the Confederacy, who is well known for his map-making skills and whose work we rely on heavily when we try to understand what was going on in the 19th century, in the Shenandoah Valley in particular, started a journal that was a promotional effort to get people to invest in the mineral resources of Virginia, West Virginia as well as Virginia. And he talks about Belmont. In 1884, he says over 1,000 acres of grapes of various kinds. Okay, so it continues. And then finally, Ashby, the cousin, gives it over to his cousin McKay, who ran the business until about 1900. And as they are running it, you can see that, again, 15,000 gallons every year, 23,000, 30,000, 15,000 gallons of wine. Incredible production. Okay, this is what Belmont looked like in 1900, and this is the office that Marcus built and worked in. That was part of the winery itself. This is what we know from 1936 when the park was established, when Shenandoah National Park was established, and there was an inventory done of properties, and they had listed on their on the forms for Belmont all of these things that said this is what this house looks like, and that's what it did look like in 1936. By 1940, well, the Park Service has done a lot of work with us. They helped us work on maps so that we could see all of the tracts of land that Marcus owned. And you can understand that as you're coming into the park, coming into Dickey Ridge and into the North District, essentially, all of this area is the land that was owned by Marcus Buck. And so we continue with that story. And many of the tracts are named, so we get pretty excited about that. This is what it looked like by 1937. It was growing in. Very typical, what we see in the Blue Ridge, the Appalachian oak forest will take over, it will regenerate, it is resilient, and if it's not cut back, what you're looking at is the vegetation that is starting to take over that landscape. This is 1947. The house was vandalized, but there was a hope at one time that the park might turn it into a visitor center. And of course now there is the Dickey Ridge Visitor Center, but the house was not kept up, and it was taken down in the early 1950s. It was gone. So what is Belmont like today? This is where the archaeology comes in. And this is where we first found Belmont. We had not done this background research. We didn't know much of the story. We just knew that there were grapevines everywhere. And so the question is, what is this place and how do we make sense of it? And so we have surveyed, as you can see, a good bit of Marcus's land, and this is all done on foot, and we use global positioning systems technology so that we are mapping everything that we are finding. And it's really overgrown. So the work that we do up there, we have to do in the winter. Hopefully not on a day like this. But you cannot see anything. By the time you get to early April, the grapes are starting to grow in, the vegetation is starting to come back. So you have to do this work in the wintertime. And what we're looking at coming in, that's the Dickey Ridge Trail on the upper left, and then it gives you partial access to the site, but the site is very difficult to get to. We don't recommend that folks go up there simply because there's no good way to get in. However, here is a map from this is one of Hotchkiss's maps from 1866. Right after the war, he continued to make maps for the counties of the valley, and this is one from Warren County. And you can see that this map actually has the road into Belmont, and you can see how it twists and turns, and that is exactly what it does. This is a very, very accurate map, but this is what the road looks like today. And as I said, not easy to get to. It's a fascinating place, but not easy to get to. But our GPS is absolutely essential. That is what has allowed us to put this story back together. So if any of you have an interest, there are really high resolution, high capability GPS units that we are fortunate to have, and it's made all the difference in the world. And so this is what it looks like as you are approaching that yard where the house used to be. And this is indeed what the Manor House area looks like today. So they have kept it open to a certain extent, but one thing you'll notice, look at all the grapevines that are hanging. Grapevines are growing all the way down to Route 340. All the way down to the park entrance. I've had people in the park say to me, why are there so many grapevines? It's like, well, there were 100 acres of grapes being grown up here. But anyway, this is our work, and what you're looking at here, these circles or these areas, that's the house and the barn and the office. And so this is what the house platform looks like today. This is the office foundation. We have found that, so we've been able to put that back together or in place. We found the barn. We know where the barn is. And we have 2 miles worth of stone walls. 2 miles worth of stone walls on that property. And I don't think we've actually documented all of them yet. But one of the really wonderful things about this is anybody who is interested in stonework, different groups of people made stone walls differently. There's been a lot of research done on what Scots-Irish stone wall manufacturing and those techniques look like compared to the Germans, compared to the English. And we are seeing different kinds of stone walls up there. So we don't know exactly what's going on, but we are starting to develop a typology of stone walls, and we've been learning a lot about how they were built. And our assumption is the enslaved were the ones who did this work, and so their technology and their knowledge are what made this possible. It's also highly probable that they were the ones who were more versed in the grape growing than was Marcus himself. And again, that is a story that needs to be looked at. It needs to be told. But there are roads everywhere up in this mountain that are connecting up all of the different tenant houses, that are connecting up the different fields. And again, you just have to get up there at the right time of year in order to see it. And then we have confirmed 4 of the tenant houses. And as I was mentioning, in the 1870 census, there are a number of African American families who are living back on the mountain and who are identified as vineyard workers. And so, as we know, Ashby and McKay continued for 30 years. And so there is, again, a good bet, I would say, or it would be a proper assumption to assume that some of those families had been trained or knew how to grow those grapes and they were the backbone, they are what made that vineyard possible. So we keep that in mind. But this is just, you're looking at all the dots of all the things we have found, stone walls and foundations and roads and everything else. It's a landscape that is just filled with the evidence of Belmont. But if you don't know what you're looking for, you're just going to say, what are all these grapevines? Essentially, we want to get beyond that. But the wine cellars. We know that Marcus in his diary writes about the fact that he's so good at making wine, he doesn't have any place to put it. And so he is pawning it off on his family members who are keeping it in their basements, in their houses. And so finally, he builds 2 3-story wine cellars. And if you take a look at this, the foundations are 6 feet tall. The foundations of these buildings are 6 feet tall, and there are 3 stories on top of that. That's how much wine was being made and stored on those mountains. The depressions for these are 50 feet across. So these were significant buildings in their day. And the foundations, as we said, are still there. We have found the 5,000-gallon cistern, and we have found what we are calling the berm, which is just a big hump, and we think that this is the winery itself. Of course, remember, nothing is standing above ground. Everything has been removed with the exception of what we would consider the archaeological remains. And so we want to understand the layout. We've got questions. You know, was there a pressing house built behind the operations center, as we say? Were the fermentation rooms below? Was this the cellar and the loading area? Got some really good questions to ask, and hopefully someday we'll be able to answer them. Right now we don't have enough information. But we again have been looking at other examples, in this instance coming from North Carolina, that are similar sized operations that are showing us what these operations look like, and we're assuming this is similar to what was going on at Belmont. We end by bringing in a really modern technology to help us put a final point on this old story, and this is LiDAR. LiDAR, for those who are not familiar, is a form of remote sensing, so think about aerial photography and satellite imaging, but this is something different. This is a plane flying at relatively low altitude that has in its belly a camera and a sensor. And what you're looking at here is an image that shows you scattered light, the photons of light that come out of that camera and then bounce back up and are recorded by the sensor. And let's just show you a little bit more about that. What you're seeing here is what we call bare earth mapping. So instead of fighting our way through the trees as you have to with aerial photography or with satellite imagery, there are so many photons of light that make it to the surface and that bounce back up. You can actually remove the trees and see what the pattern is on the ground itself. It's really quite amazing the way that it works. And so it's much better than anything we've had before. This is what Belmont looks like with LiDAR. You can see all the fences. You can see a lot of the roads. Of course, the house is right there. The platform for the house is right there. Skyline Drive over here to the right. But this is the image of Belmont. And so as we were doing this work with LiDAR and with the Park Service, we've gone out and taken this imagery with us, and we've ground truthed about 120 features. So this is the starting point to putting the story of Belmont back together again. But there's one more part of this story that is quite remarkable. We know that Marcus was writing to vintners in France, and we know that he was very interested in the way in which vintners could create microclimates around their vines in order to get a good crop, but to get a good variety, a good grape that was going to produce a good flavor. And one of the things that he learned from them was that you had to protect the vines in the wintertime. And so as we were doing this research and we were looking at the LIDAR and we were out in the field, we kept seeing these weird features that are 10 to 50 feet long. And this is what they look like. They're weird little rock wall type features, but they're not connected. They just are very isolated and very separated. And so we think that they might be heat sinks. We think that this may be what he took from his discussions with growers in France as a way to protect the vines that were growing on the north and west side, because they're not on the east side. These are only on the north and west side. And so what an interesting innovation for him. So what happened to Belmont? California wine industry is one part of it. By 1910, 90% of the wine that was consumed in the United States came from California. The railroads made it possible for cheap wine to come from California. And that cheap wine was, again, predicated on immigrant labor, but also those railroads. And so they couldn't compete economically. The eastern vineyards could not compete, but also temperance. And I will say that in Virginia, Augusta County was leading the temperance movement. As we look at this story, what you find is that Virginia passed its own temperance laws in 1914, 4 years before the federal government passed the prohibition, the 18th Amendment. And Virginia was ahead of the curve. And so the wine industry just began to tank, as did other industries as well. And because this was so labor intensive and so visible, it's not the kind of thing that you could hide and continue to produce, as we say. So we have some larger questions that are associated with Belmont. We hope that the Virginia wine industry will listen to this story and become very curious about this native grape wine industry. But we also want to let you know that we've been using some modern tools. We use the wonderful Virginia Tech siting tool that they have developed for people who are interested in growing wine grapes on their property. Should you do it or not? So they look at soil, they look at aspect, where is the sun coming in, and so forth. And this is what we got for Belmont. So you can see average slope 25%, not good, right? 61% northern and western exposure, and don't do it. Don't do it, with the exception of Norton, with the exception of the Norton grape, the only Virginia grape on the list that could be grown there. Very, very interesting that way. And yet we've got grapevines. And so the end of the story is we think the mother vines are still there. And they are big. And of course they are sending out vines that are growing all over the place. But we've been really fortunate in getting into some of these fields, and we've actually found the plantings. We've actually found the rows of the original plantings, and we've been able to identify some of the fields, the named fields, and what would have been growing there. And so the question is, genetically speaking, is there anything left? Are there any, have the grapes just all gone wild, or is there anything left from those varieties that were being grown? And so we're pretty excited about the possibility that there could be a story in the genetics. And so before Tony Wolfe retired, we were working with him, but we've also worked with Lucy Morton, who is a well-known enologist and ampelographer, and there is a lot of interest in the possibility of doing some testing to see if some of the grapes that are up there, and they do grow, there are grapes up there, it's not just the vines, there are grapes. Is it possible that some of the old varieties are still up there? So we don't know. But we do want to point out that this is from 1956. The eastern United States was a hotbed for fruit and wine, and it had been for a long time. And the fact that we've lost this history means, are there other Belmonts? And so I just want to mention that in Charlottesville, there was the Monticello Wine Company. Some of you may have heard of this, but in 1875, folks at the University of Virginia were studying winemaking. There is also the Woburn Winery making raisin wine. African-American families making raisin wine down in the southern Piedmont, almost on the North Carolina border. So how many more are there like this? Pretty interesting to consider. So the last thing, the Bucks are still making wine. They are now in Baltimore. They have Ph.D. vineyards. And I got an email from Bailey Buck a couple of years ago who said, I am the great-great-grandson of Marcus Blakemore Buck of Belmont, Front Royal, Virginia. There you go. Thank you.
All right, we have time for a few questions for Dr. Nash. Myself and Dr. Tom Benzing have microphones. Please raise your hand if you want to take or ask a question, and we'll get a mic to you.
Are the 12 or 15 varieties that you listed early in your lecture, are any of them in cultivation, or have they all been lost?
So the question is whether or not the varieties that Marcus was growing are still in cultivation today. Most of them are. Some are in cultivation only as boutique grapes, but some, like the Isabella, have made their way around the world. And of course, you know, the Catawba, the Concord are just staples. But it's what I find really amazing, to tell you the truth about these varieties, is I suspect he was probably trying more and they didn't make it because he was so tied into these networks of grape growers all over the eastern United States. We know he was communicating with folks in New York State, which had a very vibrant industry, in Cincinnati, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if there were other varieties he tried to grow that didn't work. Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that.
Have you found any correspondence with him and Dr. Norton in Richmond?
That's a really great question. In his diary, he mentions the question about correspondence between Marcus and Dr. Norton. In his diary, he mentions Dr. Norton as though he knows him, but there are no letters in special collections with the diaries. But he does mention Dr. Norton. Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a Belmont that's north of Fredericksburg. Are they related?
They are not. Belmont is a pretty common name. Yeah, and there are several of those. I know which one you're talking about, but this one is a different one. Yeah, yeah. Now the Bucks were in Leesburg. They were in that general region and then moved west right before the time of the French and Indian War, the Charles and his wife Letitia. And the thing that we do know about them is that they maintained connections with family across the Blue Ridge, and they continued to marry into some of the big families over in the northern Piedmont.
Your LiDAR data, was that something that existed already in the database, or was that something you had to like custom fly?
That's a great question. So what you're seeing is an image that came from about a $50,000 survey of LiDAR that was specifically designed for this area and a few other areas within the park. So you can go to the USGS National Map online, and there are free layers of LiDAR, but they don't give you this kind of resolution. Yeah. We couldn't believe it when we first saw it.
Is there any plan by the National Park Service to eventually open this place as a new attraction for the Park Service?
I'm glad you asked that. So the Park Service, the question about what the Park Service wants to do with Belmont, there is a lot of interest in it, of course, and I can't speak for them, but I do know that there have been various discussions about the possibility of getting a trail back in, and there being some interpretive signage. And I don't know if that will happen anytime soon. But what we would hope is that there could be a good bit more research on the ground so that we can figure more of this out, because we feel like we have just really touched the surface of this story. The history part of it is filled in nicely. We've still got lots of questions, but it's the on-the-ground work that needs to be done. And as you can see from the photographs, it's not easy. It's some of the hardest archaeology I've ever had to do. Machetes, you know, those kinds of things are involved.
Have any of the recipes been recreated?
Yes, as a matter of fact. At one point, there was a professor, a biology professor at Sweetbriar, who was growing some of these varieties and making wines that were similar to 19th century wines, but not quite as sweet, but still sweet to our taste today. Yeah, so the way that I think about it, you've heard the term dessert wine. That's how I think of this. Yeah, except it really is a dessert. You know, it's not the wine, it's a dessert. Yes.
Delicious. What's your favorite wine?
My favorite wine, oh my goodness, that's a great question. It depends on the day of the week. Reds, whites, I'm there. There you go. Yes.
I know you've worked all over the park, including some down here in the southern section. And I'm just wondering, since this was such a hidden gem in one part of the park, do you have any thoughts as to whether there might be other things that are going to pop out? If has the whole park been LiDAR flown? Have you looked to see if there's anything else out there that is, we're hearing about cities of the Mayan empires being discovered in the jungle all the time because of LiDAR. What else do you think might be out there in the park?
So we do get asked that question a lot. LiDAR is an amazing tool, but the thing about LiDAR is LiDAR will fool you. So you'll get these images back, and we've had to deal with this, where you think you're seeing patterns and you go out in the field and realize it's just an outcrop. And so there's always, the reason we have to ground truth all of this is because LiDAR is not foolproof itself. It just shows you what is there. And the question still is, what could it be? Now, in terms of other kinds of spectacular finds like this, we do know about the iron furnaces in the park, and Mount Vernon furnace at Grottos is in the South District, and that was 70,000 acres of land that was brought under the timber saw to make charcoal so that iron could be made in that furnace, one of the biggest furnaces in Western Virginia. We've got all kinds of interest in trying to follow that the iron industry along the west side of the Blue Ridge, because there were other iron furnaces as well. But to me, what I find most interesting about the park, in addition to all of the Native American sites, which we are very keen to understand, we've got 10,000 years of Native American history up in the Blue Ridge for Native American and ancestral Monacan people who are up there. But when you look at the homesteads, when you look at the homestead sites that are from the 1780s into the 19th century and early 20th century, the way that those homesteads were ensconced in those mountains and the way that people were making a living up there, those stories need to be told, but also the connections between those families, because the road system is not well understood. People were strongly connected all through the mountains. So a study of road systems through the Blue Ridge would be, I think, pretty spectacular with LiDAR.
I think we have time for one last question. Anybody?
Actually, it's a two-part question. So one, I'm very interested in the African American story, and this is going to take some time, have you been able to get to the descendants of any of the
We haven't gotten
workers?
to any of the descendants. We've started getting names. We've started getting surnames. And so we've been matching to see if there are people today in Warren County who might be related to those folks. And that's our next step.
They might have some oral histories of
Absolutely.
remembering working at the
Absolutely.
The second thing is, when John was asking about the other hidden treasures, there was a hike that I did on Little Calf Mountain this year. If you get up in there, you run into tons of apple trees.
Yes.
But then you get into a stretch and there's grapes everywhere. So
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure. Like I said, you can't imagine that something like this could exist and somebody else didn't try it, even on a smaller scale. Yeah, because they could do it. They could do it. Yeah, what a story. I told you wouldn't believe it. I said, you can't make this stuff up.
Well, let's give Dr. Nash a round of applause and say thank you.